Good afternoon, fellow book lovers. My name is Stan Thornton. I'm the session moderator for this particular session of the Savannah Book Festival. I welcome you to this 16th annual Savannah Book Festival. We're quite proud of the fact that we've been able to do this 16 straight years and still be able to make it free and open to the public. This year the festival is presented by the following: the Philip E. and Nancy B. Beekman Foundation, David and Nancy Cintron, Robert Faircloth, the Courtney Knight Gaines Foundation, and the Gerald D. and Helen M. Stevens Foundation. And we give a special thank you to the Georgia Humanities for their support of this festival. We're especially grateful to the Lemon Foundation because they have sponsored this First Baptist Church sanctuary today, which we believe is probably the most beautiful venue in the festival this week, and it's offered in honor of Joe and Carol Young. We'd also like to welcome all of our generous sponsors and Literati members, especially those that are here today. Do we have any Literati member sponsors? I thank you for your support and thank you for being here. It's through your support and the support of others like you that keep this festival free and open to the public, which is very important to all of us. As you've heard before probably, fully 90% of the revenue that supports the Savannah Book Festival comes from our donors and Literati members, and we thank you for that. Before we get started, there's always a list of housekeeping notes. If you've already been to one of these, you've already heard them, but we feel it's important enough to point it out in case there are those of you who are here for the first time and would like to know how we conduct this. Our author, Matthew Quick, is with us. He's in the wings here, ready to go. He'll be signing festival purchase copies of his book in Telfair Square. That's very near here. If you don't know how to get there, I'm sure one of the ushers can help you or direct you. It's not but about 2 blocks south of here. Matthew's told me he knows how to get there, so he'll be there waiting for you with his book, and hopefully you can get an autographed copy. If you're planning to stay in this venue for the next author presentation, George Dawes Green, once this session is over, if you intend to stay, please have a tendency to move forward. It's a great help to the ushers because we have to be very careful on the number of people in the venue, the seating capacity. So if you'll move forward, then those that are coming from other venues around town will then have the opportunity to find seating easily, and we won't have to be tramping over you to get to a seat. Please take this moment to ensure that your cell phone is turned off. I know it's awfully embarrassing for it to happen because it happened to me one time. And so please remember to do that. You're allowed to take photographs, but please don't use flash photography. On the back of the program, you'll find a QR code for a survey. We'd like for the people at the festival would like for you to take a moment to find that survey and to answer the questions in it. It's very important because the survey helps us with, one, to be continuous improvement for the book festival and all the activities that go on this week. And maybe even more important, the impact the book festival has on the city of Savannah and the visitors that it brings to the downtown area and to the city to attend the festival. Another thing that's equally important is when you exit the sanctuary, you'll be confronted with some nice volunteers who have yellow buckets. The yellow buckets are for you to make donations, if you would do so, to help us continue with the activities of the book festival in the future. Those donations are also very important. And thanks to the donations in the past, we're able to do this again this year for free. We will have an opportunity for a question and answer session at the end of the talk. If you want to ask a question, identify yourself. And it's extremely important. And I've been through this before in large venues like this. We'll have 2 microphones available. Raise your hand to be identified, and the author will help pick out people, and I'll help him do so as well. But please don't ask a question until you get a hold of the microphone. I've noticed it's very confusing when a question is answered and nobody hears the question, and then the author takes off in a direction you wonder where that came from. So it's helpful to us all if you'll first ask questions, because we got time for that. And second, wait for a microphone, and they'll be to you quite quickly. And then the author will be happy to respond. Mr. Quick is with us today, courtesy of Maggie and Roy Richard, and we appreciate their contribution to the efforts of the festival for that reason. Mr. Quick is the New York Times best-selling author of The Silver Linings Playbook, which was made into an Oscar-winning film. Also 8 other novels, including We Are the Light, a #1 Indie Next pick, and a Book of the Month selection. His work has been translated into more than 30 languages. He's received a PEN Hemingway Award honorable mention and was an LA Times Book Prize finalist, a New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice, a #1 bestseller in Brazil, a German Youth Literature Prize nominee, and selected by Nancy Pearl as one of the summer's best books for NPR. The Hollywood Reporter has named him one of Hollywood's 25 most powerful authors. Matthew lives with his wife, the novelist Alicia Bissett, on North Carolina's Outer Banks, almost a neighbor of ours. So please give a warm Savannah welcome to Matthew Quick.
Is this on? Can you hear me? Yeah? I'm not much of a podium guy, so I don't like to be trapped. I'm probably going to move around a little bit. So the book I'm here to discuss tonight is my 9th novel. It's called We Are the Light. You can check it out here. I actually purchased this one at the festival tent this morning, contributing, which you can do as well. It's a really fun experience. I recommend it very highly. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about the origin story of this novel, which begins in 2014. We're going back a little bit. It was shortly after the media blitz for Silver Linings Playbook, the movie. And my career was probably, it had never been as hot before for sure. And so I was getting a lot of speaking requests. And I got this request for a one book, one town event. And for those of you who don't know what that is, it's when a whole entire community reads your book and then you're invited to go speak. It's this great honor. And it's the second time that I had been given that honor. I did one in Princeton, New Jersey before. And so I went to this event, and it was in Ambler, PA. And I pull up to the event, and it's in this gorgeous historic movie theater, which you can actually see on the cover. You won't be able to see it probably from your seat, but when you look at the cover later, when you go to buy the book, you'll be able to see it right here. And in the novel, the movie theater is called the Majestic Theater. It's a fictional theater, but this night I was at this movie theater right there. And I pulled up, and I fell in love with this building. I'd never been there before. It's a real place, a historic movie house in Ambler, PA. And I think it was built in the 20s or 30s when the studios used to build movie houses. and they would own them. And so it's this place that time forgot. And I went in, I'm looking at the marquee, it looks like this cathedral, it's just absolutely gorgeous. And I walk in, and the people working there are just so proud of this theater. And they're showing me these historic pictures on the wall, and they're showing me the projection room, and they're just so proud, and I'm so smitten. And I keep thinking that, like, this trip was just worth it to see this movie theater. And so they bring me out on stage, and I'm the movie for the night. You know, there's a screen behind, there's nothing on the screen, it's just me up there. And I walk out on stage, and it's packed, and it's just this amazing night. There's just so much love in the room. Everybody's read the book. And I go out and I start speaking very much like I'm doing right now. And this very interesting thing happens to me. Psychologically, I start to split. And so there's a Matthew Quick on stage that night who's speaking just very much like I'm speaking to you. And he's interacting with the community. He's winning the night. He's having a great time. And then there's this other Matthew Quick that's kind of split out of my body and is standing next to me and is looking at the other Matthew Quick saying, "How do you know you're safe up here?" And it was this like weird paranoid thought. And the Matthew Quick in his body was saying, "You can't listen to this guy over here. You've got to just get through the night." And so I did. You know, I got through the night, and I did the signing afterwards, which was this wonderful experience. But I kept thinking about, you know, what was going on with this other Matthew Quick. And so I want to talk briefly about that before I can continue that part of the story. And I was somebody who always really loved going to the movies. I still love going to the movies. It started when I was a kid. My father, who's here tonight, or this afternoon, he used to take me to the movies when I was a kid. I remember he took me to see Rambo when I was like 7. You know, it's like really inappropriate moment, you know. But my grandfather used to take me to the movies, and I really fell in love with going to the cinema. And I remember seeing Dead Poets Society when I was in high school and decided that I wanted to be a high school English teacher, you know, so it had this profound effect on me. As a kid, I didn't really have the language to talk about why the movies really affected me. But as I got older, I started to figure out why. My first date with my then girlfriend and my now wife was in Center City, Philadelphia at an art house theater called the Ritz. And Alicia and I, she was 7 at the time, and I was 19. And we went to go see this movie called The Three Musketeers, starring Kiefer Sutherland. It was not a good movie. There's a lot of people out there who remember that one. They're shaking their heads. But we went to this theater, and it was a great theater. We'd go there often. And I remember there might have been some kissing during the boring parts. And afterwards, we went out on the cobblestone streets of the old city, and there was definitely some kissing there. And it began this love affair of movies that my wife and I would go. We would go to the theaters in Philadelphia religiously. And when I say religiously, I mean we would go often, almost every week. But we were also going, and again, I didn't have the vocabulary as a teenager for this, but now that I look back, we were going for a sense of transcendence. That's what we were really looking for. You'd step into a dark room with strangers. These larger-than-life images would be on the screen, these godlike images, and you'd be transported out of your life for 2 hours. And this was a really powerful thing for us. And as young storytellers, my wife is also a novelist, we also were studying the craft of storytelling. You know, we were wondering, what was it about these series of images and this dialogue that could transport you, make you laugh, cry, take you away from your problems for 2 hours, sometimes, in the best experience, change you who you were for the rest of your life when you see a great film. And so we were going to these movies all throughout our 20s and studying the craft of story. We kept going back and thinking about what's pulling us into the movie house. So I'll preface this next part by saying, you know, whenever there's, I can't believe I have to say this, but whenever there's a shooting in the U.S., and there's far too many, one's too many, it's horrific at any time. But the shooting in Aurora, Colorado, in the movie house really disturbed me. And I was a high school English teacher for many years. And when Columbine happened, as horrific as that was, I never once thought to myself, I'll never go into a high school again. That thought never crossed my mind. But after Aurora, Colorado happened, I started to worry about going to the movies. And I would walk into a movie theater, and I would start looking around and being careful about what seat I selected. And I would say, where are the exits? And I would start looking over my shoulder, who's sitting behind me? And when the lights went down, I started to feel a little bit afraid. And that really bothered me. because this was like a sacred church of story. It was a sacred place that had been sullied. And so that night at an Ambler, when I'm sitting there signing the books, thinking about why was I so freaked out, I started thinking about, how this sacred place, the movie house, had been taken away from me. That night, after the signing line, I went across the street to this whiskey bar with the librarians. And back in my drinking days, I did a lot of drinking with librarians. They're very good drinkers. So, whenever they, yeah, people know. So whenever you did an event with librarians, it required drinking afterwards. And so we went to the whiskey bar, and I had a few drinks, and the librarians were quite lovely. And afterwards, I went outside the bar, and I'm waiting for my car to pick me up, and I'm looking at the Ambler Theater, and the marquee's lit up. Again, it's this cathedral of a theater. It's absolutely gorgeous. And I just had this feeling that I had to write a novel about a historic theater. And I thought to myself, I want to write a novel about a historic theater where a tragedy happens and the community bands together afterwards and creates a piece of art to re-sanctify this sacred space. This was in 2014. I was on fire. It was like this transcendent experience, standing on the sidewalk, just having this feeling like this was going to be my next book, and it was going to be amazing. It was going to be the best thing that I ever written. Could have been the scotch, definitely could have been that evening. But I just had this feeling of this was it. And when I went home and tried to write that novel, it just would not come. Like, I sat down and I started writing, and the tone was wrong, and the characterization was wrong, and I couldn't figure out the main character. And I was somebody who, between 2007 and 2017, I published 8 novels. So for a while, I was doing a book a year. And I was putting out a lot of material. So I'd work for a couple months on this book. I would fail miserably, and I would switch to another book. I would write it, publish it, and I kept coming back to this book, and I kept failing. I couldn't figure out why I could not write this book that I felt so destined to write. So in 2017, I wrote this book, which you can also buy today at the tent down the road. It's called The Reason You're Alive, and it was a very personal book for me because I wrote it after my Vietnam vet uncle passed away. And on the night that he died, before he died, he left a message on my phone. He had been telling me all of his war stories and for years, and we had been talking about writing a nonfiction book together. And on the night that he died, he told me he wanted me to write this book, and then I found out he was dead the next day before I could call him back. So it was just like, it felt like this sacred mission I had to write this book. And when I published the book with Harper, I took it to Arlington National Cemetery, and I put a copy with a bag of cigars on his marker, and it was this really meaningful thing to me. I was writing the screenplay at the time with a very famous director. We're actually still working on developing that movie to this day. That's another story. And I went on book tour, and I had this very meaningful experience on book tour talking about my Uncle Pete and the way that I wrote this book. And I came home in 2017, and then I just kind of disappeared. And I deleted all my social media accounts, and nobody really heard from me for a while. And I didn't publish another book until 2022. And people kept saying, where did Matthew Quick go? And I was not answering. And the short answer of where did Matthew Quick go was that Matthew Quick got sober, is what he did, which was a long time in coming. Oh, thank you very much. Appreciate that. Appreciate that. It's very interesting that I said I got sober, and immediately I took a drink. Isn't that sort of symbolic? And so I got sober, and to be honest with you, the act of ceasing drinking, the act of pouring alcohol down my throat every night was not as hard as dealing with all of the feelings that came up after I got sober. It was like all of the numb things that I've been numbing for 2.5, 3 decades just came alive, and everything just started screaming inside of me. And it was this really difficult period in my life. And my strategy for dealing with this was not one that I recommend. My strategy was to literally run away from it. And so I started running obsessively. And I was running crazy miles. I got up to like 80 miles a week. I was just running, and I would just numb out. And I would just get so tired that I wouldn't feel all of the things that were going on inside of me. But I really believed, I had this kind of fantasy that when I got sober, like the clouds in heaven would part and God would come down and anoint me, touch me, and say, you did a great job. Now your life is going to be rainbows and unicorns and miracles. Is what that was my fantasy about getting sober. But instead, my big reward for getting sober was debilitating and crippling writer's block. It was horrific. And when I say I had writer's block, I would sit down every single day and struggle for 8 hours to write a sentence. And I was somebody that would pump out a tremendous amount of words on a daily. I was very prolific, and then suddenly I couldn't write a sentence. And it would take me an entire year to write 10 pages. I used to write 10 pages in a day, like no problem. And I would show those 10 pages to my wife, who's also a novelist, at the end of the year, and she would cry because they were so bad. At one point in her, despair, she said, "It's like you've totally forgotten how to write." And this was a big problem for me because not only was this my livelihood, this was my career. I started to worry, was I ever going to publish another novel ever again? But also, I had always dealt with my mental health issues, primarily anxiety and depression, two ways. Since I was a child, I was writing a lot. I wrote obsessively. It's how I organized things. That's how I process feelings. And I drank. Those were my two coping mechanisms for my mental health problems. Suddenly, I had zero coping mechanisms, except for the running. And this went on for about 3 years. 3 years of me just pig-headedly sitting down at the computer and banging away, trying to write a sentence and failing and failing and failing. And so, since Silver Linings, and that movie came out in 2012, but really since the novel in 2008, I've been traveling literally the globe. I've been to South America, I've been to Asia, I've been to Europe, all over the US, telling people, and particularly men, if you have mental health problems, there's no stigma. You should reach out and get the help. And I really believe that. But I was thrust into a media situation when the movie came out and became kind of this mental health guy before I had really figured out my own mental health. And during that whole time, the great irony was that there was one person who wasn't reaching out and getting the help that he needed. And that person was me. And I don't know why. We could talk about this in the Q&A if you wanted, but at the time, I didn't know why I couldn't reach out and get the help that I needed. I think initially it was just because I didn't want to stop drinking. I think that was the main problem. But in my sobriety, I feel now it was almost masochistic that I didn't do that. I don't understand it. But after 3 years, I was so broken, and my ego was so destroyed, and I was in such a low place, and I was so desperate that I said to my wife, I think it's finally time for me to reach out and get help. At the time, she had been listening to this podcast called This Jungian Life, which is still on. It's on every Thursday morning. It's a great podcast. 3 Jungian analysts look at the world and take on different topics through the work of Carl Jung through that lens. And Alicia said, I think you should listen to this podcast. I think it would help you. And so I started running and I started binging the podcasts. And I listened to the whole backlist, and it really appealed to me. Jungian analysis is really storyteller's analysis. We work in dreams and symbolism, and we use narrative as medicine. And so it was really appealing to me as a storyteller. I also think, too, most alcoholics, they say, you're drinking spirit because you're looking for a cheap sense of transcendence. You're looking to get back in touch with the divine. There's something in you that's reaching for more. And the Jungian stuff was scratching that itch as well. And so I finally broke down and I reached out to a Jungian analyst and I started analysis. And when I entered into analysis, I told my analyst, I'm only here to fix the writer's block. And I think we can do it in about a month. That's what I told him. And he kind of looked at me and, very carefully said, you're here for about 45 years worth of other things. And it's going to take a lot longer than a month. And I remember saying to him, well, I know you were in analysis. How long did it take you? And he paused for a second, and he looked at me dead in the eyes, and he said, 20 years. And I said, oh, okay, that's what we're in for here. And he said, it took you 45 years to get here. It's arrogant to think you can deal with 45 years worth of material in 1 month. And I was quite arrogant about that. And so I think to my credit, I dove in pretty seriously to analysis. And, one session a week became 3. And my analyst was an older man, and he was showing up routinely multiple times a week to fight for the best version of my soul to emerge. I'd never had anything like that before. I didn't even know that that was possible. And so this older man was dedicating time and his resources and his energy to manifest the best version of my soul. And a part of me became terrified that if I let myself believe in that, and if I let myself need that, it would immediately be taken away from me. That just was my fear. Like, it felt so transgressive. It felt so dangerous to let this person love me in a way that he was going to help me get better. And so I started to become incredibly paranoid about something happening to my analyst. I started having fantasies about him getting into a car crash, him having a heart attack and dying, and worst of all of them, I started to worry that I would say something in the analytic hour that would offend him, and then he would just say, "No more analysis for you," and he would just disappear from my life. And so we started to talk about this quite openly, which is what you do in analysis. And I started to, as I was thinking about this, I started to think about the fact that all of my novels are born out of some type of mental health problem I'm having, and then what I do is I drag it into the creative writing wrestling ring and try to figure it out, primarily for myself, like just to heal myself. And then, it gets going, and I create a novel, and I say, well, maybe I could sell this thing, and then it goes from there. And so I started thinking, like, what if I had a character who had this wonderful relationship with an older male Jungian analyst, and in his greatest moment of need, the analyst ghosts him, takes off. And I thought, wow, that seems like a good idea. Then I started thinking about that night at the Ambler Theater, and how I was thinking about writing about this movie house where there's a tragedy and people came together and they created a piece of art to re-sanctify the space and save their community. And I said, what if I combine those two ideas? And I said, what if I had a character who was in Jungian analysis, had this wonderful relationship with this older male analyst. He goes into a movie house one night, there's a tragedy. When he comes out, his town declares him a hero. He's completely broken. It's the lowest he's ever been in his whole life. And at that moment, his analyst walks away from him. What would he do? And at that point, I thought, I think I have the novel figured out. And so I was having a conversation with my wife, the novelist Alicia Bissett. You should definitely check out Alicia's work. It's beautiful. And she said to me, Matthew, all throughout this experience with the writer's block, you've been able to write people letters. And I love writing long emails to people. I love writing handwritten letters to people. And she said, you've always been able to write letters. Why don't you write another epistolary novel? A novel in letters. And I said, no, this is not a good idea. I said, I've already done this, and I wrote a novel already in letters. It seems gimmicky to me. Not everybody likes a novel in letters. I just think it's a terrible idea, I told her. And so I went and tried to write my book and failed for about 3 months. Then my friend, the writer Nicholas Butler, who also is an amazing writer, you should check out his work. He's up in Wisconsin, beautiful writer. He called me on the phone one day, and he said, hey, Matthew, you write me these beautiful letters all the time. Why don't you write an epistolary novel? And I said, Nick, that's a great idea. And I went and told my wife, Nick thinks I should write an epistolary novel. And I was excited, and she just about took my head off, But I think really what it was is that Alicia was seconding this, and it was kind of breaking down the resistance. And I went up into my room, and Lucas, my main character, his analyst is named Carl with a K, and I typed in Dear Carl, and I hit comma, and then I was off. It was like writer's block was broken. It was like, whew. I was writing 10-hour days. It was like the greatest high I've ever had in my entire life. After 3 years of writer's block, I'm writing, and I wrote the rough draft of the book in 4 weeks, which sounds incredibly fast until you think I'd been working on it for 7 years and failing. So I had a lot of material stored up. And so that's pretty much the origin story of how We Are the Light came to be. My analyst likes to say, I couldn't write it until my psyche was ready to write it, till I'd lived through these experiences, till I'd collected all of these experiences. And I think in my younger life, my ego was always telling me that I was in control of writing the narratives. But through this process, I've really learned that a lot of fiction writing happens on a subconscious level, and sometimes we have to really submit to that, and we have to wait for the proper time. So people ask me, what is We Are the Light about? And I always like to answer by talking about what I was thinking about while I was writing it. So the first thing We Are the Light is it's about radical love. Radical love. And my character, Lucas Goodgame, he goes through this tragedy, and when he comes out of it, his response isn't one of, it's not political. It's about how can I love the members in my community to save them? And he attaches himself to this young 18-year-old boy who has been ostracized by the community for many reasons, and he loves this boy, and he supports this boy, and makes sure that this boy transitions into manhood so he's not somebody that causes harm to society. And we live in a time now when we're always constantly talking about power, and particularly political power. And these are good conversations to have. Like, I'm for these conversations. But as we're elevating these conversations of power, I think sometimes we're relegating conversations of love. And so this novel is my attempt not to pull down conversations of power, but to elevate conversations of love. The other thing that I was thinking about when I was writing this novel was, in this day and age, we talk a lot about toxic masculinity. Again, these are really good conversations to have. As someone who personally worked with Harvey Weinstein for many years, I can tell you we need to have conversations about toxic masculinity. Toxic masculinity does not only hurt women, it hurts men as well. But the one thing that I really struggle with is that there are good young men out there, and they want to know how to contribute in positive ways to their community. And we're always saying the words toxic masculinity, but we're seldom saying the words positive masculinity. And I think that there are young boys out there that are hungry to know, what is it that I'm supposed to do to contribute in a positive way? And as I've been going around the country having these conversations, at every stop, there's one or two young men in their early 20s that just light up when I talk about these things. They are so hungry to have these conversations. And finally, it's an all-out love song to the power of art and story to heal. Art as medicine, to really heal our communities. And I think the Savannah Literary Festival is a testament to that. You see all these people coming to elevate art and story. Why are we all here today? Because we believe in this thing. It's not just entertainment. We believe that it has value to improve our lives and improve our communities. That's exactly what We Are the Light is about. So that's all I had planned to say. We can shoot on over to Q&A now. And if you want to applaud, that's cool if you want to. Thank you. And I'll officially take the pulpit.
Questions from the audience, raise your hand, get identified.
Loved your book.
Thank you.
Loved it.
Thank you.
You haven't mentioned it. Do you have any experience with angels?
With angels?
Yeah?
I don't know. I did have an experience when I was a child. When I was probably, in elementary school, between 7 and 10, I fell through the ice behind my school, and I fell quite deep underwater. And I remember thinking, there's no way I'm going to make it back up into the hole above the light. And then I felt something push up, and I suddenly was up through the hole again. And I grew up in a religious family, and my aunts made much of that. We said the angels. I remember my aunt actually drawing a picture of an angel pushing me up through the hole in the ice. And it's been a little bit of a mystery. I think back on that, and it's a childhood memory, and it becomes apocryphal, it becomes added, but I don't know, maybe that's my story about angels. Some people would say so.
Hi, I have a couple of questions.
Sure.
Well, one especially about the relationships in the book.
Yeah.
Lucas loses 2 relationships, his wife and his therapist.
Yep.
But then he gains 2 relationships, Eli and Jill.
Yep.
Where did those come from?
I definitely wasn't trying to do any type of mathematical equation. I wasn't suggesting we trade 2 in and gain 2, but I just think that in our grief, and particularly in my early sobriety, many of us have a tendency to withdraw. And Lucas withdraws in the book. And both Eli and Jill kind of thrust themselves upon Lucas in this way. Eli literally sets up a tent in his backyard, and Jill just kind of moves in and takes over, trying to help him out because she loves his wife, Darcy, so much. And I think for me, in my early sobriety, there were people that were that for me. I had friends that were checking up on me. I had friends that said, let's start a movie club. Let's go to lunch once a week. My wife was continually trying to help me. There were people that were trying to pull the best out of me when I couldn't see the best of me. And I think that that's what Lucas needs in the book, and that's what Jill and Eli do for him.
And at the end, how the community pulls through after he has the breakdown in front of everybody.
Yeah,
the
well, we
community
try to avoid
took
some
over.
spoilers here, but yeah, and I think that's it. I think as I kind of crawled out of my hole, like the thing that I really realized was that I was so afraid in my early sobriety that other people would hurt me. And I was always surprised when I would go back to community and everybody was so lovely. And I think that, the Jungian response to that is we often project the darkest parts of us, like the shadow material, onto other people. And, reclaiming that shadow and realizing, at least for me in my experience, was that it wasn't all those people out there that were the problem or the threat. It was what was inside of me, reclaiming that. And I think that's what Lucas needs to go through as well. He needs to realize that there are these people out there that desperately want to love him, and he has to let them love him, which is hard for him. And it was hard for me as well. Any other question right there in the red?
Hey, thank you so much for everything you were saying. The idea of positive masculinity is a reframing of toxic masculinity that it was really powerful and touching. And
Thank you.
it's a topic I've studied a lot as a gender studies student, and it was just really great to hear your perspective on that.
Thank you.
My question is, I'm very interested generally in the screen adaptation process, and I was wondering if you could comment at all about what that process looks like, how much autonomy you continue to have over your story as you're working with screenwriters, and if you feel like there are ever pieces of the story that maybe get lost in a film adaptation, or maybe pieces that are able to shine differently on screen, and just anything you have to say on that subject.
Yeah, the book to screen process is different every time. So obviously the first time around, I was living with my in-laws and working in their unfinished basement, and somebody came around and said, here's some money, and I said, thank you very much. I didn't ask any questions. It meant I could pay rent and not live with my in-laws anymore. Yes, please. But the further you get along and the more relationships you make, you can accrue power by exchanging money up front for exchanging money later. So for this book, I chose not to option it, but to do what's called writing a spec screenplay. So I was working with a director for a while that I'm no longer working with, but I was working with some producers. And so you don't take money up front, and that's how you can maintain control. Now, the reason why I'm able to do that is because one of my books was adapted into an Oscar-winning film. You don't have that leverage early on. But as soon as you take money from people in Hollywood and you sell the rights, you no longer have control. No matter what they say, it's just the writer does not have a lot of high rank in Hollywood. You're very low, even as a screenwriter. So it's all about relationships. So the producer I'm working with, Ellen at the Gotham Group, she loves this book. Like, she loves it. And not just like, I think it's a commercial, like, she believes in the power of it to put good things into the world. And so she convinced me, let's do this together, let's try to really keep the integrity of this book. And I was able to write a screenplay that I feel is very faithful to the novel. That said, the novel, if you read it straight through, is probably about 7 hours, and you only have 120 minutes at most on the screen. So you've got to combine characters, do some through lines, and you can't go as in depth with, in the book, I think I really get in depth into Lucas's psychology because we're reading his thoughts. In the movie, you've got to see what's happening. And so you've got to translate that into images, which is difficult and tricky. And the more that I do it, I realize how much respect I have for directors and people who work in visual mediums. So the short answer is it's all about creating relationships with people who have power and getting them to buy into your vision, and then working with these people over many years to get your vision out there. But I also like to think of it too as, working in Hollywood, I often say it's like having a Ouija board and everyone has a finger on the planchette, and like you're all trying to spell a word and there's 40 people, so it's difficult. And so you have to be realistic about the fact that there's only so much you can do, and then you have to let go. And every movie made in Hollywood is a miracle. Even if it's a terrible movie, it's a miracle that any movie gets made. It's so hard to do. And so I think humility plays a big part in it too. Yeah. Any questions? Two more here?
I hope this isn't too personal a question, so if it is, you don't have to answer it. But how do you have an interpretation now, looking back at that evening on the stage and the other you looking at you and saying, "Are we safe up here?"
Well, I mean, I could probably talk about that for about 5 hours. But very quickly, my analyst talks a lot about this Jungian idea of a protector-persecutor. So when you're young and you experience trauma, you develop this other personality inside of you that's a protector. And so if you're young and you feel threatened by something, you might say that inner protector might say, everybody's going to hurt you, get quiet, don't say anything, don't put yourself out there. And in childhood, that might really literally save you, depending on what type of situation that you're in. But the problem is that inner protector becomes a persecutor when you're an adult. And he keeps saying, everybody's going to hurt you. Everybody, don't trust anybody. And you've got to do the work, the inner work, to re-educate that person, to say to that inner being, I'm no longer 5 years old. I have agency. And that's just kind of a very simplistic example. These are subconscious, almost like malware in the computer system that you've got to go in and kind of root out and write over. And so I think that's what it was about. It's about responses to trauma that you have very early on that are unconscious, and until you go in and do the inner work and bring the subconscious to consciousness, you don't really have any control over these things. So it was an irrational response to past things, and then being bombarded with media all the time as well. What narratives are we putting into our head? Like, what are we watching on TV? What internet stuff are we looking at? And making conscious choices to combat that. My analyst always talks about going on fact-finding missions, looking for empirical evidence. So like after today, like you've all been so lovely to me, like I go into my inner persecutor protector and say, oh, here's some more evidence. Like nobody was mean to you at the Savannah Lit Fest. It was this nice experience. I mean, it's silly and like we laugh about it, but that inner being doesn't know. Like he's there to try and just to protect and make sure that nothing bad will happen. And the safest way to make sure nothing bad will happen is to get small and do nothing. But then nothing good will happen either. So that's the trade. It's not a good trade. It's a question up here.
I'm not very soft-spoken, but I'll use this. We Are the Light has a very spiritual angle to it, and you talked about having the writer's block. Do you feel that after you became sober, and was it a struggle to go from your previous writings, which did you write when you were drinking, to now you were sober and you felt like you had a writer's block? Do you feel like this story is part of your spiritual awakening and the clarity and the focus of being sober? And I was thinking of some of the writers I've looked at, pictures like Kurt Vonnegut and Hemingway. There was always an ashtray and a bottle at the side. Was that a big part of your life that you had to just detach from?
I never wrote while drinking. Drinking was the escape hatch to enter at the end of the night. It was like the safe place waiting. And I think that writing takes a lot of courage, especially the type of writing that I do, which tends to be very personal. And so knowing that no matter how anxious or dangerous that felt, there was always the escape hatch at the end. I could always drink myself into oblivion and feel nothing. Like that, it was like a parachute. It was like, I'm gonna jump out of the airplane, but I got a parachute on, so I'm not gonna, and so writing sober felt like I'm gonna jump out of the airplane and somehow I'm gonna believe I can fly. That's not a literal, rational feeling, but that's how it felt. And I was standing up there, I gotta jump out of the airplane, but I don't have a parachute on. So that's how it felt. The second part, I do feel that this book is closer to, I feel like it's an evolution. You know, I like to think that I'm evolving all the time, and that's not to say that I'm embarrassed of the former work that I did, but this is the first book that I wrote completely sober, and I feel that, like it was actually braver than some of my other work, and I feel like it was more, I was more vulnerable, and I was more open, and in a lot of ways it was, I've never suffered more for a book, and you know, I looked at, you mentioned Vonnegut or Hemingway, they were heroes of mine when I was young, you know, like big, I have a picture of Vonnegut on my wall, on my writing desk, and there are also people that, you know, killed themselves or attempted suicide and drank tremendous amounts of alcohol or were in and out of mental health facilities, and I think about that a lot. You know, a lot of my writing heroes were not people that had happy childhoods. They were not people that were at peace. And I used to teach high school English, and I had all the writers, you know, around the wall, and it's like half of them had, you know, committed suicide, you know. And so there was a real part of me, I think, that mistakenly believed I had to push things to the limit. I had to, you know, almost be unstable to be a writer. And I think that that's a false belief. You know, I think that sometimes writing sober and like going to those places is harder. And I realized that the alcohol was a useful tool in my early life, but then it just stopped serving me. And so I'm trying now to be useful in a way that's more conscious and to feel all of the emotions that go along with that, be it anxiety, depression, whatever it is, like to have to feel those things and to process those things for the first time in my life. And that's been tremendously hard work, but I would say it's definitely work worth doing, because I think when you do that work, you know, Jung would say you get closer to individuation, which means you get closer to being the person that you were meant to be when you were put on this earth. And I think a lot of what we do through the drinking or the other coping mechanisms, whatever it is that is our thing, is that it takes us further and further away from who we really are. And so who we really are, my analyst tells me, is hidden behind all of the pain. And so you've got to go through the pain to reconnect and sew that part back into you. And that's why most of us don't do it, because it's so painful to get to that. But the process of getting to that is worth it. And that's what I'm learning to accept here at almost 50. Hey, you're welcome. Anyone else? Do we run out of questions? Everybody's hungry for lunch? Yeah, question here. Yeah, sure. Oh, one more? I thought you had a question, but we're just tossing it. We're not gonna let you leave until you ask another question. That's it. You want out? Someone's got to ask one. Oh, we have one up front here. We've got a savior.
I love the book. I
Thank
told
you.
you
See, every
last
question should start that way. Thank you. It's
I
wonderful.
mean, really just sort of rocked my world. I loved it. I'm thinking about Eli, and I so appreciate that you wrote him.
Yep.
Can you talk about how you created him, like where he came from?
Yeah, so Eli in the book, Lucas, my main character, he works as a high school counselor. And one of the boys he's mentoring in the high school is this boy named Eli. And so Lucas, I've already told you, is abandoned by his analysts. And after the tragedy, he can't go into the high school. So ironically, he abandons all of the people that are counting on him too. So there's an irony there. And so Eli kind of calls him out on this by setting up a tent in his backyard and kind of forcing the issue. I think Eli comes from the work I did when I was a high school English teacher, when I was a very young man, and I became this kind of de facto therapist for young people at an age where I was much too young to be doing that. And I think that at the time, I just saw so much pain in the high school. I was working with these privileged kids, and they were all trying to get into Harvard and all the Ivy League schools, and they were all doing tremendous amounts of drugs, and they were drinking like nonstop to kind of kill that pain. And the town that I lived in was basically, as long as you get into Harvard and you win the Colonial Conference, we'll kind of look the other way on all the rest of the stuff. But these young men in particular, like when you gave them an opportunity to talk and to feel and to commune and to bond, they took that opportunity they were so hungry for it. And they had such what Robert Bly would call father hunger. Like they were looking for mentors, they were desperate for it. And this system that they were in, they kind of knew that it was not healthy, that it wasn't right, and they were looking for more. And of course, I didn't know how to give them that, but I tried. And trying seemed to count. And to this day, on my book tour, I stopped teaching in 2004, and I had students show up in San Francisco, New Jersey, just surprising me. They're adults now. They're in their late 30s, and they come and say things to me that I said to them 20 years ago. They'll say, "You said this to me, and it changed my life," and I have no recollection whatsoever of saying that. But what you realize is that you serve as a screen that they project something onto, and you hold that for them until they're ready to reclaim it later in life. And I realize how important that is. So Eli wants to make a movie. So Lucas says, yeah, we'll make a movie. I'll do that with you. I won't shame you for wanting to do that. This is what you need to heal. We'll find a way. We'll make it happen. We'll lead you through this darkness, and we'll bring people in, and we'll show you that the community is possible. It's possible for them to love you. And I always say in the book, there are two brothers. Eli's brother, Jacob. This isn't a spoiler. He's the shooter in this tragedy. One brother shoots people. The other brother shoots a movie. Why does one brother shoot people and one brother shoot a movie? Well, the book argues that the men in the community loved one of those brothers, and they didn't love the other one. That doesn't excuse what happened by any stretch of the imagination, but we have to love our young men, and they're hungry for male mentorship, and I see this everywhere, and I saw it in my teaching career. And so I think that's where it came from. So you guys have been great. Thank you so much.
Please don't forget the yellow buckets as you go out. We would love to have you participate and donate. Thanks for coming.